Alright guys, today we're going to be talking about classics. Classic books for classy people like myself and probably you, maybe. This is a response video to a video by Michael S. Deutsch, who has started the conversation. He's got the ball rolling on this one. He's been doing a lot of good conversation discussion videos recently, so definitely check his channel out. The dude's grinding, he's getting videos out there, he's making waves on Booktube, he's doing well. Go down into the description of this video and check him out, why don't you? So let's talk about classics. Now, classics are something that on Booktube we don't see that much of, and there's two sort of main discussion points that Michael raised. The first one is, what is a classic? And the second one, which is more towards the end of his video, is why do we not see so much of that on Booktube? So let's start with a journey into what a classic is. Now, I think probably when you hear the word classics, you get something that pops into your head. You might think, oh, well, a classic is something like Charles Dickens or Shakespeare or the Bronte sisters, or like any of those. Like, there's like, you hear classics and that pops into your head. And I think that is really, that's one of the key definers of what is a classic. It's a classic is something you say, you know, you can say to someone, what's a classic book? Tell me a classic book right now, and they will probably say something. And these are what I call proper classics, all right? They're books that, by the definition of a classic, have stood the test of time, been written centuries or whatever ago, and are still, people know about them. They're republished, rebranded, all of that. So here's two proper classics for me to show you as an example. The first is A Picture of Dorian Gray, or The Picture of Dorian Gray by Oscar Wilde. This is about a man who becomes a weird hedonist in Victorian London and has a magic picture of himself that gets ugly instead of him, and it's all right. It wasn't really up my street. I think I saw the point what Oscar Wilde was trying to make, but I think the dude was a better playwright than he was a novelist. It's probably why it was his only novel. This one obviously has been written in more Victorian times, and it's not that now, so it's done pretty well for itself. The next one is Rebecca by Daphne du Maurier. Again, not really my cup of tea, this one, but it is, again, something that was written a long time ago. I think it was probably written in the 20s. I think it was written in the 20s, this one. So, again, pretty old book now, almost 100 years old. Has stood the test of time. It's about a woman who you never learn the name of, and she's sort of like a sad, like, woman who's alone, and then she meets this guy, and his wife Rebecca has just died, and then they get married, and it's about their life as she potters about a house. So these are classics. These are proper classics. Like, they're things that had probably come up on a quiz or something in a pub. So what makes these stand the test of time? What makes these proper classics? I think the answer to that question is because they stood out from the pack at the time as things worth going into. Like, it's more about the writing style than the plots. The plots are very basic, but back in the day, especially like back in the old Dorian Gray days, like early novels, things like Robinson Crusoe, which is like a contender for first novel ever written, like things like that, plot wasn't all that good. Novels and writing back in these days were more for rich toffs to write for their toff mates that could read, because like way back when education levels were way low, so people didn't read a lot, so these books were more or less ways for people to show off. And in Rebecca, like the writing style is great. I think it's very colourful, there's brilliant use of imagery, all of that stuff. There's a lot of stuff worth studying in these books. And I think that's another thing that sets classics apart from more populist literature. There's more to analyse and there's more to critique. There's more to go into with these, which is probably why they're taught in schools and aren't read that much for fun, because the entertainment value is much less compared to its sort of educational value. And that's one of the things I think that stands out for proper classics. Now, the second group I wanted to talk about were genre classics. Most of these classics are literary classics. They're more, obviously, they're more contemporary for the time, based in the real world. But there are genre classics, and I think they're not talked about as much because, by and large, genre fiction has been considered trash fiction by the literary community. So let's show two examples of this. I've got one fantasy, that's The Fellowship of the Ring, or, you know, the whole Lord of the Rings by J.R.R. Tolkien. And we've got Dune by Frank Herbert. Now, these two books, I would consider them to be genre classics. And I think the reason that they are genre classics is, one, because they were written a while ago, and two, because they are representative landmarks for their genres. Like, Dune is probably one of the earliest examples of like a big space opera. And it's definitely one of the most successful examples of that. Lord of the Rings is one of the first examples of epic fantasy. Like, it is the example. Like, Papa Tolkien is a thing. Like, the dude basically invented the fantasy genre in one fell swoop with this book. So these are like landmark titles for their genres. Obviously, in other genres, there are books that exist like that, like Dracula. That's a landmark horror book. Like, these are the sorts of books that are held up as benchmarks for the later books that would come along in the genres to hold themselves up to. Normally, they originate some tropes. They will be copied and elements will be borrowed from them. And like, that's what makes these sorts of things a classic to me. That is pretty much... These are pretty much the two most classic books in fantasy and sci-fi, respectively. I mean, come on, you can't argue with that. Can you? You probably can. So the next category is children's classics. Now, I can't show you one of the books that I was going to show you because I'm using it to prop up my phone. It's a big collected fairy tales version of the Brothers Grimm. It's like this big grey hardback. You might be able to see it on the shelf behind me in other videos. But like the Grimm fairy tales, Hans Christian Andersen, these are very old stories that are now classics. They're things that everybody knows. They're part of the collective consciousness of the reading public. Like, you say, what's a fairy tale? And someone will pick out one of these stories. Like, it's like instant, you know, they're ingrained into us without ever having to really read them. Other stories in this particular field are Peter Pan by J.M. Barrie. I think a lot of people may know it now from the film rather than the book, because people don't read old little kids' books anymore to children. There's like new books about fireman dogs or something. That's what kids read now. But this is back in the day. This is like a kid's classic. So that's nice. You know, it's a story that everybody knows. And then we've got, obviously, Alice's Adventures in Wonderland and Through the Looking Glass in a nice collective tome. These are, obviously, again, classic stories that are passed down through the generations, through remakes and retellings and all of that stuff. It's a part of a collective consciousness, especially for kids. I think these are cultural touchstones in the Western world. Like, people will go out of their way to read these books, even though they were published centuries ago. Can you say the same thing about some shit like Jack Reacher one shot? Like, who's going to read that in 50 years? Like, fucking nobody. Right, so next category, modern classics. Now, modern classics are a little bit different to the old dusty classics that you'd find on your granddad's bookshelf. Modern classics were written probably less than 100 years ago for the most part. Modern classics, I think, differ from your regular classics because they're more dependent on commentating on society. Mostly, again, they'll be literary fiction based, so getting rid of your fantasy elements. So let's talk about two examples of this. We've got one is To Kill a Mockingbird by Harper Lee. I think this is pretty much like what people think when you hear the word modern classic. It's a story about racism, like in America, and like that's a big topic. Like it's a big topic that has a lot of impact on the world back when it was written, and it's a big topic now still. And like this is one of those books that it goes in depth with things, and like there's a lot, again, like with your normal classics, there's a lot to analyze, there's a lot to think about with this sort of book, and that's what makes it a modern classic, because people are predicting, based on how in depth you can go with it, that people are going to go back to it, and it's an important book that talks about important issues, and that's the big thing for modern classics. The other one is The Dubliners by James Joyce. Now, I've only got this out really because James Joyce is one of those authors that is an established modern classic author. I haven't read The Dubliners, so I don't know what it's about really. I think it's about, let's say, it's about a family in Dublin, obviously the Dubliners, presumably during a time of hardship and social decline. He writes of social decline, sexual desire and exploitation, corruption and personal failure. So that's what James Joyce is all about. Sounds like a very cheerful read, but it's an important read because, again, it talks about these social issues that were facing them at the time. It's probably well written. I think there's probably a lot to analyse, all of that stuff in there as well. And that, again, that's what makes a classic a classic. So, what have we learned? We've learned that the big key tying together for all of classicdom is there's stuff to learn from them. That's the real crux of the matter. Michael said in his video, like, classics are taught in schools. Like he said, they are on the, like, they're assigned reading in schools, and there's a reason for that. It's because throughout history, these are the books that really changed something. It either changed the way that the written word was presented. In the case of your earlier classics, it changed the way that we thought about the world in terms of your modern classics, or it became so ingrained in the cultural consciousness, like these genre classics and children's classics, that they're just like they've permeated culture and they're never going to go away. Michael brings up in his video Harry Potter, and I made a silly joke about it in an outtake. But basically, with Harry Potter, like, you can argue that that is a modern classic. I think it's still too young to be considered a modern classic, and I'm not sure if it ever will be considered a classic in a way, and I think that's a shame. It won't be considered a classic in the same way that some of these other books are. I think it has a chance at becoming a genre classic or a children's classic, but with the proper classics, like, I don't think J.K. Rowling's writing style is in depth and like, it's not, you can't analyze it enough. She doesn't try and experiment with things to enough writing wise to be considered a literary classic. I will agree that it's become something that has definitely permeated pop culture, and it definitely will last, I think, as we pass it down to our kids. Maybe, who knows, in like 60, 50, 40 years, it will be considered a classic, and maybe it will be taught in schools. It'll definitely be remembered, that's for sure. The final point I want to make in this video is Michael said that he rated SlaughterhouseFive 2 stars out of 5 because he thought it was crap. I don't know if I don't think he said it was crap, but that's sort of the impression I got. here's SlaughterhouseFive. It's by Kurt Vonnegut. As you can see, it's vintage Vonnegut. That's a good it's a good accidental alliteration. So yeah, SlaughterhouseFive. It's about a guy. It's like a science fiction book. It's more a genre classic. But I think Kurt Vonnegut hated being called a sci-fi writer. I might be wrong on that, but I think he doesn't like it. So SlaughterhouseFive. It's a book about a guy who is abducted by aliens, and it involves the bombing of Dresden, and it's got time travel. It's a very odd book. It's difficult to explain, especially I haven't read it in a while. But basically, the reason that this is a classic is because it shed a lot of light and introspection on Kurt Vonnegut's own experiences as a prisoner of war in the bombing of Dresden, which was a town in Germany during World War II. And not only is it insightful in that way, but Vonnegut's writing style is very unique. It's very dry wit. It's very punchy dialogue. I don't want to compare Kurt Vonnegut to Joss Whedon, because Kurt Vonnegut, Joss Whedon's a prick. But Kurt Vonnegut's style is basically the proto Joss Whedon. It's very bantery, it's punchy, it's witty, it's to the point, and that is there's a lot to analyze in this book about culture, the human condition. Death is a big theme in the book. It's a great book. So I'm going to disagree with you on this, Michael. I think SlaughterhouseFive is really good, and you should read it again, because I think you might like it if you read it again. Read it again. Go on. Right, before we end the video, I need to talk about the other plot point. Fucking channel reference, isn't it? We have to talk about the other point that Michael made in his video. Why do we not see so many classics on Booktube? The answer, I think, he suggested that the answer was because people got burned by classics reading them in school. Now, I disagree. I think people want to read more classics, but the reason I think we don't see them on Booktube is because Booktube is a very social talking sort of thing. People want to discuss more plot points, fluffy plot points, who was your favorite character, what was your most exciting moment, that kind of thing. There's a lot less analysis and critique on Booktube. I think if you watch people's reviews of things, they don't really review the book so much in terms of what it does well as a story and what it does well in terms of style and things like that. They're more interested in were the characters fun, were the dialogue's cool, were the action's cool. It's more surface level on Booktube. I think that is the case in almost all aspects. You see a lot of book hauls and things, and those are look at the pretty edition of this I bought. They'll buy a pretty edition of a classic, when really you get a classic and you should have a nasty old crap edition, because it's classic. It's old. It should be well read. But that's a discussion for another time. But I think in terms of critiquing on Booktube, there's a lot of surface level stuff, and I think with classics, the surface level stuff is the least interesting thing there is, especially with the stuff the Picture of Dorian Gray, for example. The plot in that book is pretty naff. It doesn't really go anywhere, but the writing style is really interesting, and the critique and the commentary on society is really interesting. So that's it. I think that's why you don't see as many classics on Booktube, because people don't want to watch videos about you critiquing old dusty books. So that's it, guys. Thank you for watching my video on what makes a classic and why do we not see enough of them on Booktube. Go and check out Michael's video. It's in the description below. As I said before, you owe it to yourself, you owe it to him, and you owe it to me. Do it for me, god damn it. and I'll see you next time.